whatever. You want stars? I'll give you stars!
Last year's remake of Resident Evil 2 finally found the compromise many fans have been looking for since the series became, well, this. It reverted everything back to its slower-paced, exploration-focused roots while bringing along the over-the-shoulder perspective that made Resident Evil 4 such a delight. It reimagined and respected the legacy of the original while standing alongside it rather than outright replacing it. And just 1 year later, Capcom is doing the exact same thing with Resident Evil 3, arguably the most unique of the older titles. The original was always somewhat lived in the shadow of its predecessor, but despite the two taking place simultaneously, they were very different games. The original Resident Evil 3 had a radically changed tone and was really the series' first step into action. Waves of zombies could occupy the screen at a time, convenient red barrels were for some reason scattered around an urban city, and Jill Valentine was more agile than previous protagonists with a 180 turn and a new dodge mechanic. These are the elements the remake brings back. It's certainly built on the groundwork of the Resident Evil 2 remake, but where that game had moments of genuine dread, the 3 remake can often feel like a step back to the later action titles. There's still instances of clever lighting tricks that have you wondering what's around the next corner, but I was never really in a situation where I didn't have enough ammo to deal with a horde. This is certainly a lot more over the top than last year's game, which is to say there's a lot more explosions, and there's a point where Jill runs away from the head of a giant toy shop mascot.
This is insane.
Yeah, that happens. And that's fine, but Resident Evil 3 was always more than just an actiony Resident Evil 2, and I'm not sure the same is true for the remake. But before I go further in, I want to emphasize that Resident Evil 3 Remake is still a fun game, and a lot of what made Resident Evil 2 so good does carry over. But there's some major elements that I feel make this a less respectful remake and an all in all less ambitious and complete game than its predecessor. So with that said, let's keep going. According to the in-game time, my initial playthrough clocked in at 4 hours and 20 minutes. And while the Resident Evil 2 remake was likewise quite short, it was still longer than this, and it incentivized you to play again as Leon or Claire with slight differences. But RE3 is one linear campaign. Defining elements like life selection that would give you choices and pivotal story moments are entirely gone, meaning unless you're going out of your way to find collectibles, every single run plays out the exact same. Even more disappointing, Resident Evil 3 has 0 bonus modes. The original invented the mercenaries, and not only is that not here, nothing is. Though you do get Resident Evil Resistance with Resident Evil 3, but due to its online nature, we unfortunately can't try it out just yet. However, I am a believer that how long a game takes to beat doesn't matter as long as it justifies its time. But that's the thing, it doesn't really. Lots of areas are over before they really come into their own, and others are far too familiar to Resident Evil 2, like the sewer, which even has an extremely similar enemy type. I mean, look at these side by side. If we change the protagonist around, this could easily be the same game. We're not allowed to show certain areas in the review, but there are absolutely more directly comparable locations. Unique mechanics also come and go too quickly. There's a point where the game teaches you that green herbs can cure parasites, but in 3 playthroughs, not once did a monster inflict this on me. And one of the best and most defining areas from the original, the clock tower, is basically entirely gone. It's just a boss arena now. Likewise, the park is pretty much cut too. Some of the locations that truly gave Resident Evil 3 an identity of its own just aren't in the remake. Now, how can I babble for 3 minutes without bringing up Nemesis? Now, this may sound weird, but the role of Nemesis has been significantly toned down, and he's not actually in the game the majority of the time. He was a relentless stalker in the PS1 game and could burst through a wall at any moment. You always had to be on your toes, but in the remake, that randomness is gone. Nemesis only shows up when the story needs him to in highly scripted, Uncharted-style set pieces. So basically, you can always rest easy knowing that Nemesis isn't going to randomly show up unless a cutscene introduces him first. It kills the entire dynamic. What was once the most prominent stalker of the entire series is now perhaps the least imposing, and is a big step down in concept from Mr. X. Now, I did admittedly grow tired of Mr. X and repeat playthroughs of Resident Evil 2, but that was an element to refine rather than cut, especially as someone as iconic as Nemesis. He's still super cool in the story, stopping at nothing to tear apart the remaining members of STARS, but that just doesn't carry through to the gameplay. It's frankly disappointing that what was once the subtitle of the game now has barely any impact on how the game plays. So despite maintaining the action, the Resident Evil 3 remake loses a lot of what made Resident Evil 3 such a unique game. Level design is far less expansive and complex, and despite the original taking place in the broader Raccoon City, you actually spend the majority of your time inside in the remake. What you experience in the demo is pretty much the entirety of Raccoon City's streets, and the world feels a lot less interconnected this time too. It's no secret that in Resident Evil 3, you revisit the RPD. In the original, it was a fully established part of the city, and you'll stumble upon it during normal gameplay. But now there's a certain point where the game changes perspective from Jill to Carlos, and after a Fade to Black, you're suddenly at the RPD with no build-up or establishment in the world. And being in the RPD as Carlos also means no Nemesis. It's still cool to revisit this haunting station, but it's the exact same as it was in Resident Evil 2, just more restricted. The remake finds itself with an identity crisis. This isn't a loyal remake of the source material, and it's also less ambitious than the 2 remake. What's here still works, but is a big step down in so many ways. It's not all doom and gloom though. The original Resident Evil 3 wasn't some flawless masterpiece. You had more flexibility with your movement than prior games, but fast-paced bosses and tank controls aren't a great mix. And if there's anything the remake does with ease, it's absolutely the combat. The dodge was always a little tricky to perform in the original, but here it's a fantastic extension of your moveset. And if you time it perfectly, you can even activate a Bayonetta-style witch time and pump in some free shots. It's a bit jarring for the tone of the game, but it still feels great. If 3 builds upon 2 in any area, it's definitely Control. You used to have to lure zombies out or take apart their limbs if they blocked your path, but now it's entirely possible to dash through them. Speedruns are gonna be fun to watch. The knife doesn't break anymore either, so you can poke zombies and make sure they're actually dead. Although on the flip side, this does take away some tension. And I can't say I'm too sad about the reloading tool going away. This was a cumbersome tool that takes up an item slot and basically mixes together ammo types. It was a needless step. Now mixing powders works just like it does in 2. You just combine them in the menu, and that's it. These elements just work better in the new style. The story is still one of the simplest in the series, but it's so much more fleshed out this time. The characterization of Jill is better than it's ever been, with my favorite design so far, and a deeper dive into her psyche. There's also some amazing one-liners.
I've never seen anything like it, but it's no zombie. It knows what it wants and won't stop till it gets it. Don't you like that in a man?
No thanks. He's all yours.
In fairness, the Resident Evil 2 remake set a high bar for the series, and 3 not meeting it doesn't mean it's bad. The formula still works exceptionally well, but it's hard not to be disappointed by the steps back it takes from both the original and the previous remake. In its own bubble, Resident Evil 3 is a quality but short adventure, but it doesn't exist in a bubble. This is the most disappointing remake to come from the series so far and ignores most of what made the original so special in the first place. The foundation of the Resident Evil 2 remake is great, but it can only carry it so far, especially with the sense of deja vu I felt exploring locations that felt remarkably similar to the ones I explored a year ago. I feel mixed on Resident Evil 3. It's still worth playing for fans of the series, but know you'll see everything it has to offer in a matter of hours, and if you played the original, expect to be disappointed by how much was cut. Capcom, if you're remaking Resident Evil 4, please take a few years off. Being simply good isn't enough when framing yourself as a remake of something with a legacy this strong. Anyway, that's all from me for now. For more on Resident Evil 3 and Resident Evil Resistance, be sure to subscribe to GameXplain.
Jill, you okay?
Carlos, that monster's on my ass again.
Are you shitting me? I thought you killed it.
Me too.